Hi, welcome to lecture on chapter 9 about John Paul II. So I have Father Brad here joining me to talk about at least one of my favorite saints.
So you know what the theme song of this class is?
I'm afraid to ask.
I like it when you call him Big Papa. Throw your hands in the air if he's the Pope player.
Oh my gosh. All right, well, on that note, let's talk about John Paul. Before we get into his life, I want to mention, I guess the first time I was really aware of who John Paul was whenever he died. So that was 2005. I was 15, and I was on a cruise ship off the west coast of Mexico. And it was spring break for us, and he passed away. I was a freshman in high school. And I had like heard his name. I like kind of knew who the Pope was, but I like didn't know anything at all about him. But I remember it was a sea day, so we weren't like in a port or anything. We were just on the ship, and I just sat in this stateroom all day and watched the news footage and was just completely captivated by this man that I, previously had known like nothing at all about.
Could you have said who the Pope was? If someone asked you like who's the Pope before that, could you have
Yeah,
said John
well,
Paul?
I would have been able to say John Paul only because of the Mass, right? So when you go to
Oh,
Mass and in
yeah.
the Eucharistic prayer, right, they pray for the Pope by name, and so John Paul our Pope and Oscar our Bishop was what it was in Mobile at the time. And so I could have,
Oscar. That's such
yeah,
a cool
Oscar
name.
Lipscomb, that was our Archbishop. So, anyways, I could have told you that probably because of that. I may have heard about him in religion class or something growing up, but like didn't really have a lot of info. But just watching the news, and it was just regular secular news channels, like CNN or whatever, and we were watching it on the ship, and it was like my parents were like, "Why don't you come up and like swim in the pool and like be fun?" And I'm like, "No, I want to watch this." And I didn't know why. Like I didn't really have any sort of reference, but it was like I knew it was something significant, even though I didn't really know him at the time.
Hmm.
And so ever since then, um, I don't know, he's just kind of popped up in my life. I have this necklace, which I didn't even get myself, that has him on it. But it says "Be not afraid," and my friend gave it to me. And it was just, I don't know, like he's just always kind of come up as somebody that is significant in my life. Just cool connections and things like that. So I don't know. Did you have any recollection of him when you were growing up?
I was right around his death. Yeah, I mean, I was a little older than you. I was a junior in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and we had Dawson Youth Conference, and Father Stan Fortuna. Do you remember him?
Yeah.
He's a rapping priest, speaking of.
Yeah.
And he just talked at the Dawson Youth Conference. It was Dawson Youth Conference was during Lent, and he died like in Easter, right? It was like April something
Mm-hmm.
2005, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it was like right, but he was dying actively. So it was kind of this thing. And that's the first time I remember was like him dying actively. And like I was just started going to youth group. So I was at Dawson Youth Conference, and he talked about how he's teaching us how to live by how he's dying,
Mm.
right? So he's being faithful. He's offering up his sufferings, and Father Stan's whole thing at that point was everybody's got to suffer. He had that rap song,
Oh
everybody's
yeah.
got to suffer. So
That's funny.
it
Yeah,
just
no,
fit.
that's for sure. I mean, that was the last several years of John Paul's life,
He had
right? And
Parkinson's.
right, Parkinson's disease. He had a whole lot of other just like health issues. He was how old was he when he died? I guess he was in his 80s, so he was pretty old. And just his body was just breaking down, like uh what happens in old age. But um our textbook talked about this particular story, which I hadn't heard before, where uh, as he was dying, he was in the papal apartments in Vatican City, and they're right above the square. So you can walk into St. Peter's Square and you can see the window of the papal apartments. And apparently there were all these young people that were there that were praying for him just outside his window every day as he was dying. And apparently he sent a message to them from his deathbed and said something about I've searched for you and now you've come to me. Because his whole papacy, he always had this particular ability to reach out to the youth of the world. And I think that that is something that started whenever he was a priest in Poland, and he was a university chaplain, and he was going on all these, kayaking and skiing trips and out in the mountains and speaking to young people. And the movie Karol that we watched shows that a bit. So.
Yeah, another moment was the part of Fishers of Men when I was discerning, and this is right around that same time. I mean, he's past his dying. Like, I just had a conversion at Steubenville Conference that summer before my junior year, so 2004. And I was watching Fishers of Men one time. They were showing it at like a youth conference, and it was a discernment video, and it showed like the priesthood, but then it had this section on John Paul II. And there was these like shots of the crowd like going crazy, and then this one shot of this girl just weeping.
Yeah.
Whenever John Paul, like, she saw John Paul come by, and I would just remember being like, "That dude's awesome. He makes girls weep." I mean, like, in a good way. He didn't like make fun of her, and
no, he had this kind of like magnetic energy,
star.
Yeah, he really was. He was a rock star.
Well, there's actually an SNL skit about
is
this.
There?
It's with who's the guy who plays the banjo?
Steve Martin.
Steve Martin plays the Pope.
Oh,
so he's
funny.
the Pope because he has like kind of like grayish hair or whatever. And like the whole joke is it's like outside of a music venue. So there's like a bouncer who's like not only allowing some people in, and like there's like nuns that are like kind of elbowing their way in, and they're like, "Come on, let us in." And then finally Steve Martin comes out, and he's like, "I'm the Pope." except it's like,
I was about to say, I know that was an Italian accent, but yeah.
But it was just funny because it's actually kind of accurate with religious sisters. They're pretty
vicious when it comes to the Pope.
They're hardcore. Like they will elbow a priest in the jugular.
Oh my goodness. Close. It's probably true. Just a couple stats about his funeral. When he died, 1/3 of Earth watched. Isn't that crazy? Like the ratings on the news channels, 1/3 of Earth's population. So there were 2 billion people, over 2 billion people that were watching. Oh, look, pastor's calling. You better answer it.
Hello. I'm recording in the hall in the priest cave. What's up? Okay. I'll call you after. Bye. He just called to say I'm doing a great job.
I'm sure that's what he's saying.
That he's really appreciative of my priesthood, my brotherly help, and my talent.
I'm sure. I'm glad nothing's on fire. All right.
He's like, "Hey, currently the hall's on fire, so are you in there?" Yes, I am.
So at his funeral, there were 2 million people that came to Rome just to witness his funeral. And during that time, people started chanting just like spontaneously in the crowd, Magnus, 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 which means great, 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 right? So people knew like immediately when he died that he should be considered one of the greats, right? And there's only, 3 popes before him in history that are considered great, and people typically say great after their name whenever they say them. So that's a pretty big deal.
Gregory the Great,
Leo the Great, and I think there was Nicholas the Great as well. I hadn't heard of that one, but the book mentioned him, so I don't know. But anyway.
Well, and isn't that the chant Santo Sabino? It like means like a saint now, like make him a saint now.
Oh, maybe that was probably that too. But people were saying just like great, great, great as well.
Yeah.
So he had a 27-year papacy, which was the 3rd longest in history after St. Peter himself at 35 years and Pius the 9th, Pio Nono, right?
Wait, real quick. Sorry. Santo Subito. It means famous demand. Santo Subito means, oh crap, I'm behind a paywall on the Washington Journal. Okay, never mind. Just keep going. It
um,
means like make him a saint now. Okay.
that's what you said initially. All right, so Pius IX, Pio Nono, who was pope for 31 years. So 27 years, he comes in third longest papacy in history. So it's pretty significant. When he was elected, he was only 58 years old, which is kind of crazy to think about because typically popes are much older than that whenever they're elected. He was a bishop at 38. Can you imagine?
I mean,
That's,
Grace,
yeah,
that is scary. I'm 32.
yeah. You're not a pastor yet, so I don't think they're about to make you a bishop at 38.
I know. I'm like, I got so much to do.
Anyway, he was the first Polish pope ever, the only Polish pope ever so far, and the first non-Italian since the 1500s. So it was really significant that he was elected when he was. And I thought the movie did a pretty good job of kind of showing that he was a compromise candidate. There were two Italian guys that they were kind of fighting between and nobody could decide. You have to have a certain margin of victory. It can't just be a simple majority. It has to be like, a certain number. I don't know exactly what it is, but they couldn't decide between these two Italians. And so somebody suggested his name. And it was significant. It was weird. He was young. He was, pretty well known, but because of all of the writing that he had done and his presence at Vatican II, but he was sort of a unexpected, I think, candidate. And so it was pretty cool when he was elected. All right, so let's talk about his early life. He was born May 18th, 1920 in Wadowice, Poland, which is a small town. His name was Karol Wojtyła. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it in Polish.
Wojtyła.
Wojtyła.
Yeah.
It has like the little L with the little mark on it, but I don't know Polish, so I don't know how to say it. But he was called Lolek, though, by his friends and family. His father was an officer in the Austrian army, which is interesting. And his mom died when he was only 8 years old of kidney failure. And only a couple years later, when he was 12, his only older sibling, his brother, who was a doctor, died of scarlet fever from the people that he was treating. He had an older sister too, but she died in infancy even before he was born, so he never knew her. When he was 18, his father and he moved to Krakow to let him study at the Jagiellonian University there, but that was only a year before the Nazis invaded Poland and the university was shut down. So they show that in the movie, the university being shut down and some of the professors even being shot. Just part of Hitler's whole thing was to suppress the culture of the Poles, as well as various other ethnic and religious groups, because if you can suppress somebody's culture, their literature, their philosophy, their poetry, their music, then you can break their spirit, right? And that was, I think, Hitler's whole thing, was that he wanted to make sure that he could control these people. And it was a different culture than what he saw as the best, which was his Aryan culture or whatever. So that's why it was shut down. So basically he had to go into hard labor. He worked in a rock quarry and then he worked in a chemical plant after that. But underground the whole time he was reading, he was studying, he was praying. He was a member of the Rhapsodic Theater, which was that underground group of people who were acting and kind of trying to preserve the culture of Poland secretly. And again, the purpose of that, like in the movie, they kind of talk about that and the tension between, like, why would you, in the middle of a war, instead of, planting physical sabotage, or going out and trying to kill Nazis or whatever, like, why would you just hold secret plays in the basement of someone's house? Like, what is the point of that? So do you want to speak to that at all? What do you think?
Well, it's so there's a quote by Dostoevsky in the Brothers Karamazov, correct?
Mm-hmm.
In which one of those characters says, "Beauty will save the world."
Mm-hmm.
And while the fallacy of the Nazi Party getting its roots in like a nihilistic worldview, meaning like nothingness. So think of like Nietzsche's philosophy, where he's like, there is nothingness and um, there's no meaning kind of thing. If that is your worldview, then beauty will actually be the weapon against it, because whenever you see something beautiful and true and good, you're more likely to recognize the dignity of the human person.
Mm-hmm.
So we cannot simply fight evil with violence, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, self-defense and all that is necessary,
Mm-hmm.
and he would recognize that as well. But the long run, like in the long term,
Mm-hmm.
how you fight evil is with truth, goodness, and beauty, the transcendentals, because that's what lifts up the human person. Or else it's just a constant back and forth of like violence against violence, and go back and forth and just retribution. And that's where you get like things like the mafia and Don Corleone having to go, Michael Corleone having to go make a hit on the guy because he made a hit on him, and then he
Yeah,
goes
it's just
away to
this.
Sicily.
It's a constant cycle, right? It's unbreakable, and
Why'd you just break up my Godfather reference?
you had enough. You had enough time. Uh, anyway, so yeah, so during that period of time, he really focused himself on what he could do underground, and it was during that time that he discerned his vocation to the priesthood. He entered the seminary in Krakow and was studying underground because the seminary was officially shut down, but unofficially still operating secretly. And so during that time, he was also helping he had a lot of Jewish friends in Poland, and he was helping them to hide, just doing all sorts of things underground that was a sort of nonviolent opposition to the Nazis. He also in that time discovered St. John of the Cross, and they mention this in the movie. There's a man who was actually a real character, Jan Tyranowski, was a real person in his life, and in the movie they kind of make it like he meets him kind of randomly, but in real life he actually knew him for a long time. And he was a mentor to him in his local parish, I think, and they sort of helped form these underground prayer groups to just support people's faith during such a hard time as the Nazi occupation. So anyway, he introduced him to St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, who were the famous Carmelite reformers from the 1600s in Spain. And St. John of the Cross particularly wrote that poem, The Dark Night of the Soul, which deals with, I guess, finding God in what seems like darkness, seems like God has disappeared, and in a time that in a time that he's experiencing this hardship during the war. I think it spoke to his situation very well, and gave him sort of a way to find God in the midst of that darkness, in the midst of that what felt sometimes like emptiness, but was actually really God drawing him closer to himself. So after the war, he was able to be ordained, and he was sent to Rome, and he was sent there for studies so that he could get his doctorate in philosophy and in theology. And then back in Poland, he just worked as a parish priest, a university chaplain, like I mentioned before. He taught ethics at the University of Lublin, and he mentored young people just in all of his time there as a chaplain. So during that time, like I said, he would go into the mountains, he would go on these trips. Poland is under the communist regime now, so they have a little bit more freedom to kind of move about, but are still kind of looked down upon by the communist government and kind of suppressed. Not as bad as with the Nazi regime, but still pretty, I guess they couldn't do everything out in the open. They couldn't speak their
Yes.
ideas freely.
So
So,
the this type of ministry he was doing with the college students, it's called accompaniment, is how he spoke of it, or he wrote about it. And it was very, nowadays you think of it, you're like, oh yeah,
mhm.
Father Matthew or Father Ruben or Father Brad will come on a trip with us to the mountains, and we'll go hiking and kayaking, or they'll come to our retreats and like play dodgeball with us, and that wasn't the case then.
Right.
It just wasn't. In general, it was like the priests were kind of up on a pedestal. If you became a priest, you maybe you suppressed all like your what you love. Like maybe you like to play dodgeball as a kid, but then you became a priest and you can't play dodgeball anymore. Where he was like, no, I'm just going to keep kayaking. And so he'd take these college students up there. And this is actually where he was receiving the, I guess, the datum or the
Mm-hmm.
data
Mm-hmm.
of what later would become love and responsibility, and then the theology of the body was in these relationships he saw happening in college, because kids eventually would fall in love and get married, and he would
Right.
marry them. He knows them, and so
Mm-hmm.
he was collecting all this experiential knowledge of marriage, dating, marriage, relationships, and all that, man and woman, and the theology.
Mm-hmm.
But when he was talking about persecution, when he was in the mountains, he would ask them to call him Vujek, which means uncle. And
Mm-hmm.
so this was because, communists might come up to him at some point and be like, what are y'all doing in the mountains? Are y'all being all free and stuff? And they'd be
Yeah, like,
like,
are you
yeah, this
talking
is our
about your
uncle.
religion that you're not supposed to be talking about? Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was
And
sort of a
so
cover,
he was uncle,
right?
which he's like their uncle, so it wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So I think that it's really fascinating to see. And honestly, the first time I really thought about this was when I first started teaching juniors several years ago. I think it's like about 5 years ago now. Started teaching juniors, and back in that time, it was before we switched our textbooks over, and the curriculum was for the juniors to do church history all year, and then the last quarter to do the theology of the body, which seemed a little bit disjointed, going from history to theology of the body, which is something that is more like moral theology, and it seemed very like kind of different. And so we eventually kind of reorganized the curriculum to where the sophomores take theology of the body and juniors just focus on church history. But in that first year, I noticed that we ended our church history unit talking about John Paul II, and then we jumped right into theology of the body, which actually kind of made sense. And it was in doing that study in that order that I recognized the relationship between his whole like political experience growing up, and what it means to be in relationship with another human being. And there's all these crossovers. So he develops this idea that really he's jumping off of the church's tradition, right? Like he's staying within that vein, like but he's developing this understanding of like the personalistic norm, right? That like every single human being is deserving of love, right? Like no matter who they are, no matter what they did, like if you are a human being, you're made in the image and likeness of God, and what is due to you is love and nothing less, right? And so it's interesting because when you talk about that in terms of theology of the body, you're thinking in terms of relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, marriages, and yet he also is seeing this at play in every relationship across the board, including relationships between nations, between classes, between various elements of society that like he sees in his Nazi occupied Poland as well as his communist occupied Poland. What happens when every single human being is not treated with love, but is treated as a thing to be used in order to accomplish a goal, right? And so if, in a personal romantic relationship, if I am using you in order to gain some sort of pleasure or gain some sort of status or something like that, then that is a problem, he says. But that also applies to nations, right? Like if I use a certain class of people to establish the type of society that I think is going to be perfect or best, that's still a problem, right? That I'm using a person, and that's never the correct way to treat a human being. And so he saw that kind of in vivid color, in his life. And I think that both his experiences on the political level and his experiences with those students in the mountains, finding their way in love and relationships, and him counseling them and hearing their confessions and like understanding like what's going on in their hearts and all of that, that just led to this very holistic understanding of just ethics in general and love and respect for humankind. So I think what's really beautiful about him and his theology and his philosophy and his life is that it's so consistent. There's such a consistency in him that like everything kind of fits together and makes sense. And there's implications in every branch of learning and knowledge and life and love and, just everything. So anything to say about that?
No, you nailed it.
Okay. When he was 38 years old, he was made bishop. They show that in the movie, which I'm pretty sure was a true story. He was actually called out like off of a kayaking trip in order to come and receive the appointment to bishop. But then pretty soon after that, he went to Vatican II. Vatican II was open in 1962, right? And so he would have been, let's see, he would have been 38 and 58. So he was just over 40. I guess he was 40, 42 and 62. So still pretty young, but he was one of the main writers of the Declaration on Religious Freedom, along with John Courtney Murray, who was the Jesuit we talked about before. Interesting perspectives, somebody coming from a country where there was not religious freedom under both regimes of the Nazis and the communists, and somebody who experienced religious freedom his whole life in America, right? And so the two of them and their perspectives, kind of cool to write that declaration. Also, he contributed to one of the major 4 constitutions, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, which we mentioned before. We're talking about Vatican II. And so he helped to write that as well. He was very famous for his kind of optimistic attitude towards going out and engaging the modern world, and kind of saying like, okay, what are the modern philosophies? What are people thinking? What are they searching for? What are their hearts really longing for? And how can we present the gospel to them as the answer to those same questions? And so you kind of see that in the Karol movie whenever he meets with a communist guy, specifically that Julian Kordek or whatever, who's the communist leader in Krakow, and he talks to him several times, and he basically tries to say, look, like, we want the same thing, right? Like, we want a just society for people. We want people to be loved. We want true freedom. But John Paul would say to him, look, like, how you're trying to accomplish freedom is not going to make people free. It's only going to oppress them. But Jesus Christ has the true answer to what it means to be free. And love, not in a cheesy way, but a true self-sacrificing love is the only thing that will establish, a society that is built on principles that will last and that will make true freedom. So he's willing to engage, like really try to get inside people's heads and understand what they're thinking and where they're coming from in the modern world. Like, what are all these modern ideas, all these problems that people are experiencing? And then how does the gospel respond to that? So, whenever he was 40 years old, so just before Vatican II, he did publish Love and Responsibility, which was that first precursor to what would become the Theology of the Body, which was actually not a book that he wrote, but a series of Wednesday papal audiences. Whenever he became Pope, he would go out into St. Peter's Square every Wednesday, as the Pope still does today, and give an address about some topic. And for 5 years, he gave addresses about the theology of the body. So just like life, love, and relationships. At 43,
It was basically like his like papal story, like Instagram story. You just add them all together, and it became a book.
Basically.
I mean, not really, but it was like little snippets.
Yeah, it was little speeches like that were just, one day at a time kind of thing, for a few minutes. Like, they probably weren't longer than like half an hour, if that.
It's amazing that he can like construct like a very complex thing and over
little tiny bits.
You too can write a book if you just do it every day for a little bit.
Right, that is true.
Let's talk. Can we talk about this real quick? Love and responsibility. Like,
go for it.
Like the idea that, so remember personalism. So his personalistic norm, like all of ethics, and what we mean by all of ethics, all of morality. Like, what is morality, kids? You're sitting there, you're watching the screen, you're like, Father Red, Miss Grace.
Miss Krause.
Oh, crap. Miss Krause, what is morality? What is ethics? Okay, I'll let you think. Okay, stop thinking. Answer me. Now go, I'll let you answer. Okay, ethics and morality. It is the study or the thought about what we ought to do,
Mm.
how we ought to act, right? Should we do this? Should we do that? Is it wrong to do this? Is it wrong to do that? And instead of making a decision about what's right and wrong based on all these external factors about like money, economics, politics, like what's best for me, what's best for society. Instead of that, what we start with, or like some circumstance or my intention, like, well, I intend to do good with it. Well, it doesn't matter. What are we going to start with? We're going to start with the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So the other person in the encounter, the situation, what's best for them, right? And this found its way into Gaudium et Spes. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, go ahead. You're good.
Well, I was just going to say it found its way in one of my favorite quotes from Gaudium et Spes, and it's from John Paul because of love and responsibility, is man only truly finds himself with a sincere gift of himself. So like you only really know who you are because that's really what you want to know. How many people are like, I'm quitting my job and I'm going to find myself. And you're like, okay, well, if you want to find yourself, just go like live with some missionaries of charity, like go to Calcutta, or Calcutta, wherever you are, right?
Yeah,
so
like find the place where you can serve, right? Yeah. That's why we have service hours in school. Like it's not just to like make people check boxes, but it's to kind of throw you into an opportunity where you get to see people serving and understand what it's like to make a gift of yourself, and like even if it's kind of like feels forced in the moment, like when you get there, a lot of times people have experiences where they're like, wow, yeah, like that was cool. Like I actually
and you
felt
become more
something.
who you were meant to be.
Yeah.
And here's the deal. So that philosophy then applied to his book Love and Responsibility, which is the foundation of theology of the body, is that love brings with it a responsibility to the other person. Love is more than just an emotion. It's more than just a feeling, right? It's more than just what I can get from me, which is a lot of times how the world sees love, or not, they might not say it, but that's how they live it out, is what they act like it is, which is if it's something for me to get something for me, whether that's sexual pleasure or emotional pleasure or prestige or whatever. Instead, with it comes responsibility to other people. And so like family, wives, spouses, kids, your neighbor. So it's more than just a feeling.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this also became, Love and Responsibility also became a major source of Paul VI writing Humanae Vitae after the council, which we talked about before. It was the kind of famous for denying the use of contraception. But that the reasons why like are rooted in John Paul's theology of the body, right? And rooted in that particularly love and responsibility. All right. So at 43 years old, the Archbishop of Krakow, he was ordained the Archbishop of Krakow. So he was elevated to Archbishop. In just dealing with the communist regime in general, he was known as being tough but flexible. I think they did a really good job of portraying that in the movie. Patient, clever. He still stood very strongly, demanded the right to construct churches and to organize, because what they were trying to do is to create this communist state, which was atheistic in nature, right? So there were new cities that they were creating, like Nova Huta, you saw in the movie, where he was like, there's no church in Nova Huta. This is the new city, right? Like, this is the thing, without the churches. Like, we don't need the churches. But the people of Nova Huta wanted a church. So, because the Poles were Catholic, right? And they had that to their core. Poland had been a Catholic nation for over 1,000 years at that point. And so it was just a part of who they were. So it was really oppressing them more than anything. Okay. So he demanded that.
Kids, I just want you to think about what the world would be like without the church. There's no Christmas. There's no Mardi Gras. There's no St. Patrick's Day. There's no Sunday. In fact, there's no Sunday fun day.
You just work every day.
Your communistic lords would just tell you that you don't get a break because this is about what you can give us, not about you
Mhm.
worshiping anything else beyond us. The government
Mhm.
becomes
Mhm.
the the God, right? And so
And
it,
this, oh, go
it's
ahead.
so boring. It's so boring, kids. It's
It's
so
true.
freaking boring. Okay, keep going.
There's that this can happen though, on the flip side too, right? So like in a communist state, you can have that, but it can also happen when we become slaves, rather than slaves to the state, we can become slaves to ourselves, right? So on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have that sort of rampant individualism that we see a lot in our country, where we have a more capitalist economy and it's a more of a free market, but we tend to be consumers that just want to get the new and greatest and best thing, and I just need to consume and consume and consume and just get, and it's all about what I can do for myself and how much money I can make. And that can also become a god, right? A false god that can
Mhm.
become something that takes over our lives and destroys our relationships. If I'm more concerned with climbing up at the ladder of success, so to speak, then that can destroy my family, right? And maybe some of you have experienced that in your own families. But yeah, it's there. We always kind of have to be on our guard, to drift over to one side or the other, too individualistic or too kind of anonymous and like just the state or the group or whatever. Like we have to be looking for both. What is the common good, but also like what is the good for each and every individual person, that we are individuals, but we're made to be communal, right? And so if the whole society suffers, then we're going to suffer. But also if certain members of society suffer, then it's going to affect the rest of society as well. So John Paul was trying to really keep that in mind whenever he was kind of standing up for these things in Poland. Um, the other thing he did, just to mention, they mentioned in the movie and the textbook, that he ordained priests secretly from Czechoslovakia, which was still going through kind of a worse communist regime. And they snuck across the border and he ordained them and then sent them back to their people. A lot of them were probably martyred. Um, but yeah, so that was kind of a cool thing that he did as Archbishop as well. All right. So when he finally became Pope, he had just like an incredible papacy, and it's going to have lasting impacts like into the future. We're only, I think, just starting to begin to see the impact of his papacy, but um, he was the most traveled pope in history. He made 104 pastoral visits to 130 different countries. And then just within Italy alone, he made 146 visits. Um, since he was the Bishop of Rome, he really wanted to go and visit all of the parishes of Rome. And there's 333 parishes in the Diocese of Rome. And he visited almost every single one of them. And so that's pretty cool, just to kind of show his pastor's heart that like even as Pope, even as the leader of the Universal Church, he still does have a diocese, right? And so he was trying to kind of be present to his people there as well. This is an interesting fact that the book mentions, that it's likely that no other person in history encountered more people face to face than John Paul II, because he traveled so much, because he was actually physically present among the crowds. People actually saw his face. It wasn't just like through a screen.
Yeah.
That he probably had more human contact like with people around the world than any other
Well, I
person in
mean,
history.
what you're thinking is, I mean, you can limit it to the 20th century, right? And 21st century. So if you take away everything else before that, because anybody would have more chance to be face to face with a bunch of people in the 20th
Mm-hmm.
century, because he flew to all these different places,
Right.
105 different things, whatever. The kings of Europe and stuff, the really influential, wealthy ones, they wouldn't be in the fray with
Mm-hmm.
everybody.
Yeah.
So like you weren't having all these audiences. In fact, that was
Mm-hmm.
a big storyline in The Crown, but I won't get there.
Yeah, you wouldn't see people face to face as often.
And so another popes throughout history, one didn't travel as much
Mm-hmm.
and wouldn't see as many people face to face. So he's like constantly having people
Mm-hmm.
walk up to him. He's like the anti-quarantine. He's the anti-social distancing.
Yeah,
He's
when you
like kiss
see
every
the
baby.
when you see the crowds in St. Peter's Square every single Wednesday, right? For his audiences, you have people, he's driving around in the Pope Mobile after the audience, you know, and people are like reaching out, waving at him and seeing him, and he's blessing them and
Well,
everything, you know.
why do you need the
So
Pope Mobile?
why do you need the Pope Mobile?
Well, it's a transition into what happened.
Oh, well, he was in the Pope Mobile when that happened.
Well, I mean, he was in a Pope Mobile, but it didn't have glass on it. Like now, some of the Pope
They
Mobiles
have,
have like glass.
yeah, actually, I feel like Francis at the beginning of his papacy said that he like wanted the glass taken down. But that was just a very Francis-esque thing to do, to not have the glass. Because I'm pretty sure when I went to a Wednesday audience with Pope Francis right after he was elected in 2013. And he was like, you know, 5 feet from me going by, but there wasn't glass on the Pope Mobile. Okay, so so whenever John Paul was actually, when was that? The 80s? It was during the 80s. I don't remember what year. But he was, after a Wednesday audience, he was traveling around St. Peter's Square in the Pope Mobile, and there was a would-be assassin that shot him 2 times. And so he was from a terrorist group. They caught him and he was sent to jail. And one of the most like iconic photographs, I think, from John Paul's papacy is him sitting in the prison cell with the guy forgiving him. And so the guy that shot him was very moved by his reaching out. And eventually I think he experienced some sort of conversion. But he also was kind of like, his mind wasn't all there, I think. But he had this pretty profound encounter with John Paul, and it was kind of amazing that he could go and literally just like sit in a chair next to this guy and like pray for him and forgive him to his face, you know. He credited it really was a miraculous survival. It was like the bullets like pathway through his, I think it was like his stomach or his side, just like, I mean, millimeters missed his vital organs, that like he would have died if it had been like a couple of millimeters, you know, to the right or to the left, of where it hit him. And he credited that to Our Lady of Fatima, to whom he had a devotion. So one of his mottos of his papacy was Totus Tuus Maria, which means totally yours. He took Mary sort of as his mother, really focused on her spiritual motherhood in his life, particularly after his mom died when he was 8. Just kind of held on to that throughout the rest of his life and had this deep devotion to Mary, promoted the rosary. He was the one that gave us the luminous mysteries. So before, when you would pray the rosary, it was just the joyful, glorious, and sorrowful mysteries, but now we have the luminous mysteries as well, and that was credit to John Paul. And it was her feast day, Our Lady of Fatima, whenever he was shot. And so he actually made a pilgrimage after he recovered. He made a pilgrimage to Fatima and took the bullet that was in his body, and placed it in her crown on the statue at Fatima. And that's still there, I think, or it's at least somewhere, maybe even in the Vatican. But it's a pretty amazing story.
I mean, that's a relic.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
Technically only a
This
second class relic.
Yeah, this is inside my body. Yeah.
It's only second class.
Yep.
Unless there was blood on it, and then it's first class.
True. All right. So while he was Pope, he wrote a ton. He wrote 14 encyclicals, 15 apostolic exhortations, 11 apostolic constitutions, 5 books, including the bestseller Crossing the Threshold of Hope. He beatified 1,300 plus men and women, incredible number, canonized 482 new saints, and then he created 232 cardinals. So some of those guys are still around today. And then during his time, he called 6 plenary councils of cardinals and 15 synods of bishops, to discuss various matters and come up with declarations on some things. So yeah, just like he did a ton. Obviously 27 years, a long time. The book talked about and I think you can really see this in the movie, his personal sanctity, that like everybody who knew him knew that he wasn't just this great figure, you know, politically or as like a leader of an organization, but he was someone that was very deeply in love with Jesus Christ. And he had this relationship that kind of permeated everything that he did. And that was the inner strength that he had, that like in the movie, there's times when they, especially the communists who are watching him, they mention like he has this inner strength that's scary and we don't know where it's coming from, right? Like how does he continue to persevere through all of this hardship and be this like very loving human being, right? Like after all that he suffered. And that is really only attributed to grace, right? To that divine life that was very clearly in him through his relationship with God. There's numerous examples of that, just lots of stories about just little things. Like people would say he was always sneaking off to the chapel as Pope, and people would be like, he has an appointment, where is he? And he would be in the chapel in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And there were times when they even tried to hide, like he was in a new building that he had never been in before, and they were trying to hide the chapel from him. They like took the sign off the door of the chapel so that he wouldn't know that that's where the Blessed Sacrament was, because he had like a lot to do and he needed to go to all these meetings. And
The
apparently
secretary's like, take that sign down because he'll go in there and then
we'll never get him out. Yeah. And so he was like walking down the hallway and he like passed the door and then he stopped and then he backtracked and he like looked at the door and he pulled it and it was the chapel and he went in. And so just little things like that, where he was just very in tune to the presence of God. He just really, really loved the Lord. There's numerous pictures of him in prayer that are just like, even just seeing him at prayer was sort of moving for people. But one of the things that he promoted is the sort of, he coined the phrase, the new evangelization, which is not going out to the parts of the world that has never heard the gospel before. That's just regular evangelization, right? And the church exists to do that always in all places. But he kind of coined this term, the new evangelization, to talk about representing the gospel to places that were once Christian and have sort of fallen out of their faith. So our country would be considered one of those places that the new evangelization could take place. That basically there's a lot of people in America who like know who Jesus is in a certain sense. Like they know the name Jesus, they know Christianity. It's very commonplace to people to know about Christianity where we live. But yet there's a lot of people who don't really practice the faith anymore. They've kind of fallen away from it for various reasons. And they may kind of know who Jesus is on a surface level, but they don't like know Jesus, like personally. And so John Paul was encouraging people to go out not only to these nations who have never heard the gospel, but to these nations who think they have heard the gospel and really haven't. And so I think that that was a huge contribution of his papacy and his writing, to kind of talk about that and like, how do we do that? And also just using the new methods of communication in the world, the new media, in order to evangelize. And so, how are we reaching out to people, not just face to face? Face to face is extremely important, but also, through social media, through YouTube, through, whatever else, news sources and movies and shows and different ways we can communicate the gospel, through art and just like all these different ways. So that was a huge part of his teaching. And then I mentioned before his love of the youth. He created World Youth Day, which happens every couple years at a new place in the world. And there's been some of the largest gatherings of people in human history at World Youth Day. I think Manila in the Philippines.
Manila was the biggest.
Yeah, Manila. So it was like millions, right? There
like
was
3 million or something.
Yeah, like all gathered together in one field just to like go to mass with the Pope and kind of see him speak. And it's just amazing. There's a lot of really cool stories. I had you guys watch a video from Chris Stefanik where he talked about his own experience at the World Youth Day in Denver in 1993. There's a lot of people around that are, I guess, Gen Xers that were youth whenever that happened, and they went to that in our own country, which is pretty cool. And Denver
we're
really
too young for that.
Yeah, Denver, I was 3 in 1993. So, but Denver became sort of this hotbed of new evangelization efforts in our own country. I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a ton of really large Catholic organizations that are founded in Denver and like are headquartered in Denver. One of which is Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, which is a very John Paul-esque thing.
We
I
have
think
that LSU.
Hmm.
And also John Paul likes skiing. So it's probably like, you
Yeah,
know what, let's go
in the
to Denver.
mountains. Yeah. In fact, I think he was the one that mentioned it, that wanted it there. And everybody was like, why are you going to go to Denver? That's such a random place in the United States.
Well,
Like,
and they
yeah.
actually, no, this is real. At the time, and still right now, I mean,
Hmm.
Colorado, it's kind of it's not much history, right? So
Hmm.
it's not much Catholic history. Like
Right.
you think in New Orleans, you're thinking like in the
LA, or
Floridas,
like,
in LA,
yeah.
or Texas, maybe one of those cities that has
Hmm.
like a lot of Hispanics. It's already this founded Catholic culture.
Hmm.
Denver was like hipster central. Everyone
Not
told
yet,
them,
almost. There just
no,
wasn't a
no, but
lot
like
there.
people,
Yeah.
there wasn't a lot there, but people
Yeah.
told them like it's not going to be good. Like there's
Hmm.
not going to be a lot of people that come because it's just not a very Catholic area. He's
Hmm.
like, watch me.
Yeah. And so then millions of people show up, and it's like, it's this huge event in the history of
KP2, we
"We
love
love
you.
you." That's what everybody chanted at the World Youth Day. So,
And
um,
all the little like high schoolers like, oh, John Paul, ah,
like that
and then
whole
not
rock
going.
star thing. Yeah. So it's just funny, like if you talk to a lot of priests today who are like, in their 40s or whatever, like a lot of them were there, and like that impacted their own priesthood, and like, or their own discernment of the priesthood. And a lot of people found their vocations and like really kind of had conversions and came to the faith. It just became faithful lay people, and whatever else, like just because of the impact of seeing like a tiny little dot of a person, like hundreds of yards away, like on this stage, and people just for some reason are totally, and not just some reason, I mean the reason is his holiness, right? That people were attracted to Jesus, who was really showing himself through John Paul. So a lot of people talked about him as if he was a mystic, that he would just had this like deep spiritual connection with the Lord through his prayer and through his perseverance. And then again, like his, just his death, the way that he suffered in the end for the last several years of his papacy, just like calmly, quietly offering up his suffering for the world, for conversion, and just like showing people that the elderly are not to be discarded, right? But that they have something to teach us even in their
Mm,
suffering. They have something to contribute to society. Not that that is, we're not defined by like what we contribute, right? But it's something that I think we oftentimes overlook, that somebody can teach us great lessons through their wisdom and through their even their suffering, their physical suffering, just like how they stay close to the Lord in those times, and be inspiration to us, just like in our daily lives. So, yeah,
truth.
I don't know if there's anything else. There's so many other things we could talk about. He was really supportive of the vocation of the laity, especially after the council. There was a lot of emphasis on like how are lay people called to serve in the church, and he
Mhm.
was really supportive of various lay organizations. He was really sensitive to women's issues. He wrote a really awesome encyclical that girls, y'all should look up, called Mulieris Dignitatum, on the dignity and vocation of women, which is really cool. Just something that not a lot of people had really been talking about in the church before him. Not that it wasn't important, but he kind of was able to give a new perspective, I guess, and kind of, I don't know if I would really even call it new, but he would kind of draw out things in a new way, that was really supportive and cool, I guess, for us as women. So that was a cool thing about his papacy as well. And again, I think that had a lot to do with his reflections and his counseling of people and relationships, and just like his close proximity to marriages and family, and to women in the workforce, and all of that. Like he was just a real great advocate and supporter. So anyways.
Well, I think my parting words will be like, I think what he did was he changed the face of orthodoxy because he brought dynamism. So
Mm,
what do I mean by orthodoxy? I mean like right belief. Like he stood
mhm.
by
The
the
church's teaching.
foundational, the church's teachings about what it means to be moral, what it means to be a Christian, what ought we believe, these things that can kind of seem stuffy to the outside world. They'd be like, oh, you're behind the times, you're not very cool, and you're kind of boring if you believe and profess and follow the church's teachings. And Jesus wasn't like that. He wasn't stuffy or boring. And John Paul II wasn't. He was like, hey, you can be engaging and very relevant to the world. He was like, think about how relevant he was. A third of the entire world thought it was important for them to watch his funeral. Bono thought he was the coolest. Bono doesn't think a lot of people is the coolest.
Y'all Google Bono and John Paul II and look for some pictures.
There's a great story where John Paul, it was right after he died and he was at a concert. Bono was doing a concert and he dedicated a song to John Paul. And he was like, he told the story about being in an audience where like John Paul was like, I like your sunglasses. And Bono gives him the sunglasses.
There's a picture of it. Yeah.
And he puts Bono's sunglasses on. And Bono was like, he didn't know how to express it. He really didn't. He was like, there's just something about him, you know?
Yeah.
And John Paul probably believed and professed and represented a lot of things that Bono doesn't like.
Yeah.
Right? Bono's the most conservative, like Orthodox Catholic person. He is Catholic by baptism, but like he probably rejects a lot of church teaching. But the way John Paul II loved people and expressed the truth and expressed the faith, it didn't matter to these people. He met them where they were at, and that's where you gotta get. Like we need you, high schoolers, to go into your stories, into your chat rooms, into your
chat rooms. How old are you?
Onto your Facebook wall, into your AIM groups.
Was that MySpace?
Go on your MySpace and make Jesus your top 8.
Oh my gosh, y'all don't even know what that means. Oh man, we're old, Father Brad.
That's what I gotta say.
Cool. I think for me, I think just his impact in spreading the church's teaching, again, in this kind of holistic and consistent way. The fact that you cannot put this man in a box when it comes to like, you know, conservative versus liberal, or like in America, like Republican versus Democrat or whatever. Like he does not fit into any of these categories, right? Because Catholic teaching doesn't fit into any of these categories. There's, you know, care for the human person, no matter what, no matter where. And so that means, you know, the elderly, that means the unborn, that means the poor, that means immigrants, that means, you know, it's just like everybody. It's like no matter who you are, like the Lord loves you and therefore we should love you, right? And so I think that he's just really cool because, you know, you have people from all sides of the spectrum thinking that he's amazing. You also have people from all sides of the spectrum thinking that he's not cool, right? And all of it is sort of a caricature of like who he really is. And so I just think it's cool that you can't put him in a box. And that the reason you can't put him in a box is because he really fully embodied Catholic teaching. And so you don't see that, unfortunately, a lot. So we got to be that, you know?
True.
That's all I got. John Paul, pray for us.
Totus tuus,